Yay, we're in business. Welcome, everybody. And we're happy to have you. This is going to be a cool 37 or maybe more minutes, depending, how many questions we get, depending how excited you're going to be to have us. My name is Aleš. I'm hosting this thing, but the important man of the hour is Cliff Hazell, my dear guest. And we're going to be talking about his expertise regarding scaling up businesses, focusing on the right thing, and making sure that you are actually achieving what you need to achieve. Is that right, Cliff? Am I missing anything?
That sounds good, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So the way this goes is we want you to ask us questions, share with us, where you are from, what you're doing, what did you have for dinner or lunch or whatever it is to keep this kind of lively. So please use the comments, use the chat, use whatever you have available. We are going to be looking at it, and any questions that you're going to post in there, we're going to pick up. So that's the rules of engagement in here. And we're going to go right into the weeds. So I want to know, Cliff, first of all, uh, what are you actually doing? What's the deal with the stuff you do? How are you helping leaders to actually achieve what they want to achieve?
Yeah, cool. So I have some experience with companies that have been growing fast. I spent about 4.5 years working with Spotify from 700 to about 5,000 people. And during that time, I learned some things about kind of the leadership journey that you go on as an individual. Maybe you go from leading a small team to a much bigger team. In a founder situation, maybe you were the founder of the company, you used to do the coding or something like this yourself. Now you manage people who manage people who manage people who do the things. And that kind of growth journey and that learning journey is interesting. And I help people kind of through that and to figure out how to build better organizations and how to keep the team kind of pointing in a good direction, while also creating a good environment and culture that things can operate without too much heavy handedness or having to kind of very actively keep everything running, if that makes sense. Uh, yeah, that's at a high level what I do. Does that slightly answer your question? I've lost the sound. I don't hear you.
Say again, losing my sound.
There we go. Now I hear you. That's back.
There we
Good one.
go. Cool, cool, cool.
Cool.
I was just saying, I was actually muted in awe of what you shared already. So let's talk about lower flying altitude, because what you said, it sounds really cool, but I don't really know what your day to day is. What does it mean? So suppose you have a customer reaching out to you and say, "Oh, Clive, help me. I have a problem with." What would be the problem? What are they reaching out for? What are you
Mm.
fixing for people? Where do you start? How do you progress? you know how does it look like?
Yeah, so there's kind of two common things. One is from taking kind of the organizational lens and looking at the company as a whole, saying, so, we've got a bunch of different teams that need to do many different things in order to build the products that we build. How do we actually operate this thing effectively? And sort of the dominant model that I use for thinking about these kind of concepts is mostly in the space of flight levels. I think about how do you kind of create these effective interactions, not just focusing on building teams, but teams of teams, if that makes sense. How do we connect them together and up to the strategy? So that's sort of on the organizational side. The other is maybe taking more of an individual lens. So I would work with somebody like yourself who says, hey, I'm dealing with this particular challenge or problem within the context of my team, within maybe my personal growth trajectory, some kind of learning or objective that I have on an individual level. And that will be much more like coaching and sparring, where I'm at times maybe a bit of a knowledge expert on some of the things related to change or whatever, but I'm usually not the technical expert. So I can't tell you how to design the systems. I have a background in product management. I've led technical teams before, but I'm not usually making those kind of decisions. It's more taking care of the process, sometimes holding your hand and saying, hey, this is something, it sounds like you've already got a solution. Maybe you should just go, stop overthinking it. Other times it's like, whoa, slow down. Maybe you haven't thought about this enough. It can be a little bit of all of those things, and helping people basically to find better outcomes with the effort and the skills that they already have, is sort of unlocking their own capabilities and the organizational capabilities that exist. Um, that's what I like doing. I sort of just describe it as being at the intersection. If you look at a lot of folks in this industry, they're either very focused on results or they're very focused on the people. I think you need both. If we have happy people but no results, people don't stay happy for long. And if we focus only on the results at the expense of the people, they tend to burn out. And so we need to actually find a good intersection between these two and balance a little bit, not just over indexing in one direction or the other. Um, yeah, that's what I like doing.
Sounds cool. I want to hear a little bit more about the team of teams. That sounded pretty
Mm-hmm.
cool. But before we go there, I'm just curious. Is this really how people would approach it? Because I would assume that people, or the leaders, especially people leaders, senior managers in companies, they wouldn't call you unless they have a problem, right? Or is
Mm.
is is it really happening at, oh, Cliff, everything is going fine, everything's cool. I'm kind of meeting all my KPIs. I just want to kind of get it even higher. That's not what's usually happening, right? Usually it's like, oh my God, my team's on fire, fix me.
So often what it gets described at is say we've got 10 or 15 teams all trying to do stuff. They're all dependent on each other. We're bumping into each other. We're getting in each other's way. That can be one variation of the description. The other is perhaps a bit more from the leadership perspective. Hey, I get a ton of escalations. I've got all these problems that keep coming up to me. I'm not sure which ones I need to deal with. Some of them I want to kind of empower the teams to deal with themselves, and figuring out that kind of a dynamic. So how can we create an organization that kind of manage and be a bit more not just autonomous. There's a great quote from Don Reinertsen that I really like. He talks about if you want to create autonomous environments, what you need to do is not just decentralize the authority to make decisions, but also the information that is necessary to make good decisions as well. And I think often there's this sort of tension is that we say, okay, cool, you're now empowered to make decisions, but I have all of the customer data, or I only am the only one who knows about the budget and the constraints, or actually I'm the only one who has the relationship with the VP of marketing, and you need to work with marketing. And so you're trying to sort of somehow communicate across these funny boundaries, and build relationships. And so as the leader in that space, I can either provide you access to that information, leverage the relationships and skills that I have, or help you to actually build some kind of sensible process to keep in sync and coordinate across multiple teams. Yeah, I like the question. It's sort of digging into a little bit more of the detail of what happens. It's it's a big topic and there's a lot to talk about. So
You kind of answered partially the team of teams and what it means, right? So that would be what you define as the growth pains of the company when they are kind of outgrow the systems they supported them, and they can't communicate internally.
I think when you're small, what happens often is that everybody sort of sits around one table, and I can reach over and say, Alish, can you help me with this thing? And we have a conversation, we figure it out, and we move on with our lives. Once we get to sort of 3, 4, 5,000 people, it's departments in other buildings, people building infrastructure and tooling I've never even heard of, all kinds of complexity that comes into it, and everybody's got a different goal from each department, and it's a lot of complexity in that space. And so trying to bring some simplicity and some coordination into that. And that's often, the thing that I think specifically where flight levels helps in this context, because you're saying it's not just the software development teams that need to build this piece sort of in an agile software development approach. We need to work with marketing. We need to work with the sales teams. We need to work with the ops and customer support teams to build a good customer experience. Everybody wants to be customer centric, but at the end of the day, when you look at a lot of the diagrams for different frameworks and models and tools they're using, the customer's maybe one little point over here somewhere in a diagram, but the reality is the customer's affected by everything that we do. It doesn't mean we have to have the customer involved in every single conversation, but we need to actually talk most likely internally across some of those boundaries and start to have a healthier conversation about, we can't just sell the thing and then deliver something different and then support something different and deal with the problems down the line. Let's connect it a little bit more together.
Sounds good to me. I'm wondering here, and I have a couple of questions related to that to kind of drill deeper. It's so people reach out, people say potentially, something like, this is the company grew too big, we are not able to achieve, there are miscommunication, there are problems in here. And if your customers are similar to the people I serve, they have some misconceptions, right? I mean, on high level, it all makes sense. Like, for example, I prefer the event design, making sure that large scale conferences and workshops work well.
Hmm.
And the leaders usually believe that something is really simple. It's like, oh, you just do it this way. And for example, for me, it's hybrid events. People think that hybrid events are, that's the same as doing like a conference in one room. It,
Hmm.
it isn't, right? It's way more complex. So what would this be for you? What would be something that your customer, the leader, someone approaching you, think, okay, I just need to tighten this bolt, I'm good. Uh, they think it's simple, but then you look into it and say, no, 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 this is going to be a lot of work.
I would say that sort of the general example I would describe as change. A specific example would be something like a internal organizational structural change, for example. We've got 10 teams and we want to split them up into different constellations so that we can work better together. Maybe we're building a platform or a product, or we want to connect marketing a bit more with the product teams or something like this. Um, Very often that work I see it getting done in the boardroom or done by the leaders only. And the challenge that I spend a lot of time explaining to the leaders is that it's not necessarily that you have the wrong point of view. The issue is that basically you're only able to know the things that you know about, and therefore you end up solving only management problems. And the management problem is obviously important to solve, but sometimes when you don't take into account how the teams are affected by it, how maybe the adjacent functions and departments are affected by it, you create something that's often suboptimal. And so what we often end up seeing is this sort of loop. Every sort of 6 months to 2 years, we're reorganizing our teams and restructuring how we do internally. And I think the challenge with that is that very often the better way to do it is to deal with a lot of the turbulence during the design stage rather than in the implementation stage. So let's talk to people, let's get some second opinions, let's find out, what have we overlooked, what have we missed. And I have stories and examples of how we've done this in multiple organizations, not just at Spotify and companies before and since, where we actually do a collaborative redesign of the organization and involve a lot more people. Not 100% of people. We're not doing design by committee, but we're just getting some sense making done by the rest of the organization to say, this is a complex situation. There's 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people affected by this change. It probably makes sense that we involve them a little bit in the design of that change. And yeah, I think that's something that often gets overlooked. People sort of like, oh, well, we just move some boxes in the HR system. We tell everybody what it is. They say yes, sir, and off they go, and then everybody works magically in some new constellation. I don't think this often fixes the problems, but it also often actually creates some new turbulence. I used to like that person. I worked with them before. Now they're in some other team. What about my friend who, we want to collaborate together? We're not in the team anymore. All kinds of questions and challenges that emerge. And so, yeah, um, that's something I think people they oversimplify it when it's actually a very, very complicated thing. Um, yeah.
Would you say, that's kind of follow up? Because I'm thinking now, based on what I've seen as well, some of these things might be self-inflicted. Some of these things might be, well meant, but basically a mistake from the get-go. Some of it might be just unavoidable. Uh,
Mm.
Can you just, look at this when the customer requests your services and kind of thin slice? Okay, this one you messed up. You shouldn't have done that in the first place. This one I kind of understand it happened.
I think it's a delicate balance. I generally try not to take work where I don't think that I can add value. I don't find it particularly helpful to get involved if there's not something clear that I can contribute. Um, I also generally, I mean, one of the things that I do with every client that I work with is that I say, look, if we get to a point where we run the course of what we're doing, and maybe we didn't plan it that way or we didn't expect it to be unnecessary for me to be involved anymore, let's stop the contract now. I send you the current month's invoice and then we're done. So we have a longer term agreement. Like, it makes sense that we probably spend more than some weeks doing these changes because they are big and complicated. But it doesn't make sense that we just keep kind of keeping me around and fighting about contracts or something like this. I want to avoid all of that. So if you feel like you've lost interest, or maybe the momentum has changed, there's a new CEO sometimes comes in and says, we're going this way now. Cool, let me go do something else with my time. Rather, I'll be useful somewhere else where somebody needs and can make use of my help. Um, I think in the sense of, and I mean, there's a lot of different things inside there, but generally what I try to do is focus on what are the key things that a number of the folks inside the organization are feeling pain points around. So a big part of what I do at the start is, maybe I talk to you and you say, hey, Cliff, can you come help me with this problem? I make notes and listen to the things that you're saying, but then I go and talk to a few other people and get a sense, probably with you in the room. Maybe sometimes, we'd have some separate private conversation or whatever. But what I'm trying to do is find sort of the overlapping points where everybody is describing a common pain point, because we can start with something there so that we all feel the benefit of some sort of change or improvement. And that's often what I advise people to do when they're doing any kind of structural change. It's very tempting to include 10,000 possible things. you're going to take a new pill for every problem that you have, but then you're taking this huge bucket of pills, and it's kind of hard to swallow that all in one go. So let's just take one pill at a time, and let's do the one that's going to fix the pain that everyone's feeling. That would make a lot more sense. And of course, then we can explore some of the other ones. Um, yeah, I think that's kind of how I would describe it. Pick a small change, go with it for a while. If it's something needs to change in a different direction, as we learn more, then let's go in a new direction.
Got it. And I really, really like the pill metaphor, because it also can refer to these contraindications when you have a bunch of pills from different teams. Have my pill, have my pill, have my pill, and then you are sick of all the solutions that are kind of patchwork.
I think that's something that is a little bit unusual, perhaps, about some of the work that I do. I don't say that I come with no kind of ideas of solutions or whatever, but what I'm trying to do is find and unlock the capability that already exists within the organization. It's almost never that you run into an organization where there's a lack of ideas of what could be changed or improved, and it's usually never even a lack of possible solutions to the problems that other people are seeing. But what we have is we have everybody trying to, like, too many cooks in the kitchen, or like my analogy of too many pills. We're trying to take all of the pills, and then one of the pills is causing another side effect over there. It's making somebody else sick. Somebody's coughing now as well, and like this is another problem. Which one caused the problem? We don't know. Which one caused the solution? We also don't know. So let's try to focus our attention a little bit, and that's it's sort of there's almost a meta loop on it, because usually what we're doing is we're trying to create focus on the change, but the change itself is also trying to create focus on the product development work or the operational improvements that we're doing. And so, sort of at a zoomed out level, a big part of what I'm helping companies with is to actually create focus on a few key things, because we have the capacity we have. What we're usually done is we've spread ourselves across many different things, and if we can realign that to maybe a slightly smaller number of things at a time, we actually get more stuff done over the course of the year. And conceptually, everybody knows this. The challenge is the habits and the organizational behavioral patterns of consistently behaving in that manner. Because it's much easier, unless you show up at my desk and I say, yeah, sure, I can do that thing. It sounds super cool. I like you. I'm going to do it for you. But I did that for 5 other people as well. And now everyone is super, super busy, because everybody else also did this. It turns into chaos pretty quickly, and it's well intentioned. I don't think people are trying to create this situation, but how can we get out of that habit and say, yeah, cool, nice idea, not yet, let's finish what we're doing first. Or if we're going to swap to that thing, let's shut down something that we're doing and switch our focus to that if it makes more sense. Yeah.
No, sounds good to me. Sounds good to me, and I think it actually that's a nice entry way to the flipped version of the previous questions. There are
Mhm.
certain things you mentioned that could be simplified, streamlined. Focusing on fewer things might actually free your hands to do them better. So what would be the situations when your client might say, no, we have to do it this way, we have to track it in 7 different ways, we gotta do all of these things, and you say, oh well, you don't. How would that look like?
So, so I mean, if I interpret this question as what's something that people make complex that is actually quite simple, I I mean, I would say there's probably a number of different things. The main one is really this focus thing. What I often see companies doing is going, cool, well, we've got some spreadsheet voodoo that we do to try to come up with what's going to be the most important thing. We multiply this number by another invented number times by the phase of the moon, whatever, and then we get some magic answer that tells us, this thing, and we get 17 priority ones. And so now we work on all 17 at the same time. And it's just, I mean, I've never seen one of these things that works. And the thing that it always doesn't solve for is that question of, for everybody in the company, which is the number one thing. And so I like to talk about this concept as sequencing. So in the organization, there should be one number one priority. And people kind of go, oh, but we could never do that. It's like, what do all the other people do? Well, they work on something lower down on the list if they can't help with number one, or they stay out of the way of the people who are working on number one. And if they're needed, then they switch up and work on number one. And you just don't see this happening in the organization, because what we've done is we've said, well, marketing has one list, and sales has one list, and finance has a list, or the product people have one list, and the HR people have another list. We give all of the requests to maybe the operational teams, or to to the IT teams or the product development teams. And they're sitting there with like 6 different lists. Each of them has one number one, but nobody knows which one is number one. And so what we've done is we've created the situation where every individual in the company is picking for themselves, really, which one do I work on? And so that's creating massive complexity out of something that can actually be really simple. And the good news is that if you pick any number one and you just say this one's number one, in almost every case you will get a better outcome than not picking a number one. You can of course still have the conversation, which one should we make number one, and you can improve and optimize with that. But just saying this is number one, everyone else please either help on this or get out of the way of everyone doing number one, goes a huge long way. The metaphor that I like to use is this thing that we used to use in some of the teams that I worked with at Spotify, which was don't let your number three block your number one. And if you can get in the habit of doing this, you just start to see the number one thing is actually it's like a fast track. It's flying through the organization. It doesn't get blocked. It doesn't run into. I mean, it doesn't. I don't say nothing gets any issues or whatever, but when an issue occurs, it gets fixed and then it moves forward. It's not sitting there waiting for somebody else who's doing the other thing, and we're all kind of chaos around. And yeah, to me, that's something that I see people constantly. Prioritization is really hard. It's priority is really hard because we don't actually make any decisions. We make it simple by giving each department a different list. So
Well, I mean that got me to a kind of rogue idea. Would you go so far, Cliff, to say that for in some teams it might be even better to just draw an idea from a hat and say this is number one, like pick a random number?
I mean, you joke, but in all honesty, I think in many cases it actually would be. People often ask me, how do we pick? And I say the important thing is that you pick. It's less important actually which one you pick, because it doesn't matter if you pick the right number one, but then you actually treat it as number 17. It doesn't make any sense. So when you can get in the habit of making something actually the number one, then start to worry about which one is number one. And my experience is that in most cases, if you've got a list of options, the chances that you pick a totally stupid number one, I mean, it's pretty unlikely. It's pretty rare. And if you're doing that anyway, then I don't know. That doesn't seem to me like it's a sort of a big prioritization problem. There's obviously something else on the go there. Then
Yeah, no, that's very interesting observation there. It actually reminds me that the story I read about the Amundsen and Scott expeditions trying to be the first on the pole,
yeah,
while the Scots expedition was focusing on a bunch of things, right? They wanted to be the first and do research and use ponies and use motorized sledge and whatever. Amundsen just said, "No, I'm there first. That's my number one. That's it."
yeah. Sometimes removing all of the complexity and the noise around the side, like I think so often. I mean, we do this as humans. We want to start some new project or idea, but then we overthink and make it massively complicated, so we end up not starting. The way you make something really interesting and cool is you start and then you figure out what's next and you add a little bit more, and you evolve forward from there rather than this, I don't know, big bang crazy approach. I think, I mean, there's situations where that probably is a feasible thing, but it's certainly not the vast majority of the work that we do in a company.
So when you mentioned that, I'm wondering, does this apply to all companies you work with or all projects? Because what you mentioned is that the act of choosing is crucial. That I agree with. Like just choosing something makes all the difference. At the same time, you kind of imply that almost any process can be approached as iterative. But it's another quote I'm thinking now. Is it just this
Yeah.
attributed to what is it? Edison, like the light bulb was not invented through incremental improvement in candles. So can you
Sure.
really be iterative everywhere?
I want to just. I think the point is not so much just the choosing; it is also the behavior of consistently choosing. Because people think that prioritization is an event like at the beginning of the quarter, the beginning of the month, but actual prioritization is something you do every day, perhaps even every hour. Every time you pick what to work on, you're making a prioritization decision. So it's not an event or one-off thing. If you're building something like a light bulb or trying to invent a light bulb, you have a goal, right? You probably don't start with, I mean, maybe you go wide and you try 500 different things, but probably you're not trying to invent a light bulb, and a thermostat and, something to boil the ocean and a hot tub and a new electric car all at the same time. You're doing one thing. And so I think the point for me is less about incremental and iterative. It's about starting, getting some signal. Does it work? Does it not work? And then changing course based on that, saying, okay, what do we need to do? Do we need to go in a totally different direction because we've gone this path? We're not finding anything here. Let's go this way instead. Or is it, oh, we've got a little bit of, we think there's something here. Let's spend a little bit more time to iterate. Um, Often what I see people doing is the opposite, which is they just build and build and build and build, and then they ship it, and then nobody uses it, and they go, that sucks. Like, yeah, well, that was a bit of a silly approach. You didn't know that it worked. Maybe what you should do is take a little bit of that, increment and iterate and explore at the same time, if that makes sense. I don't hear you again. I think you're muted.
You're right.
There we go.
My pen was scratching in here as I was furiously making notes of what you said, because what you actually described can be applied to teams, but it's also crucial for individual contributors. This act of prioritization and choosing repeatedly can make a huge difference for everybody.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I wanted to ask as well. I mean, I have a couple of things, but before we do that, I see we have a lot of people joining us live, and I want to give them also the opportunity to be part of the conversation. So do not hesitate. Use those. I call them fingers, and you can just type your questions. We're gonna show them on screen, and I see we have some already, and see what's happening in there. Maybe we answer them. So let's see what we have in here. There we go, Florian. So I'm going to read it out loud. In your experience, what are some convenient ways to convince the guys and girls at the top to actually choose a number one and not a dozen ones? So it's a question from Florian Mücke, if I'm
Yeah.
pronouncing it right.
So, a story that I often tell is this one of prioritization. So you imagine, excuse me, if you imagine a scenario over the course of a year, company works on 4 projects. They start 4 at the beginning. We work on all 4 until the end of the year, and then everybody is done and we're happy. We get a nice bonus. We go. We have a nice Christmas. Everyone is super cool. Uh, an alternative approach is, instead of working on all 4 of those projects at the same time, is to pick 2. You can have a number 1 and a number 2, but pick 2. Uh, Work on those 2. Probably you finish them somewhere around about summer, June, July, something like this. Then you ship them, and then you switch on to the other 2. And the benefit of this is that the main benefit of this is that you get both some feedback from actually delivering those products, but also what you get is you get revenue for the 2 whole quarters for the rest of the year, right? And so the reality is that basically what you're creating is a scenario where, instead of being busy for the entire year, you're actually getting some return on your investment for 2 whole quarters. The good news, as I explain often to the CEO or the CFO in this kind of a context, is that you can also pick which of the 2 projects are the ones that you're done or that you're doing. And so what you get is basically free money. And almost every company, in my experience, would be interested in getting some additional free money in that sort of situation. I think the key in this, Florian, is to try to speak in language that other people find meaningful. And in my experience, saying, well, we're super busy, we've got lots of dependencies, like, yeah, cool, that maybe resonates for the individuals and the teams. And that's maybe the way that I would talk about it if I was talking to a bunch of software developers or, internal functional teams within the org. But if you're talking to the folks who manage maybe big projects or programs, talk about that return on investment side of things, and you start to see usually a different conversation. I would also say that very often you might make that case and people go, oh, well, that's just not possible in our situation. In which case I go, well, it's like the law of gravity. You don't have to believe in it for it to be true. It is what it is. And I don't usually be sort of, argumentative about it. It's like, okay, cool. Well, if you don't want to do that, then do whatever else you want to do. And when you are interested in doing that, let's come back and have a chat. There may be some other challenge that is bigger than this issue at this particular point in time. And so, yeah, I rather wait until people have got some energy and enough time to basically be able to jump into it. Yeah.
It's cool to me, but now I'm kind of scratching my head, literally and figuratively. So why don't you go all the way? Why don't you go with 1 project per quarter? Why did you say 2? What's the magic there?
I say 2 because usually when you pick one, somebody goes, there's no way we could only pick one. And I think that's the issue, right? The point I'm trying to make is that usually the number that you need to pick is less than what you've currently picked. I also want to have a conversation about the sequence, because the conversation we can still have there is, if we pick those two, if they were in tension with each other, or we need people to, some people are needed for both of those projects, which one should they pick? Can we at least create a situation where everybody who picks one project above the other one picks the same project above the other one? And that's really all I'm trying to address there. So if we can get into the concept of, like, yes, we agree, doing less things at a time creates better outcomes. The benefit also is that, like, I think often what people get hung up on is like, well, what do the rest of the people do? I'm sure they have a lot of smart ideas, and I'm sure you're not short on projects. Let them just work a little bit lower down the list. So keep on down the list until you run out of something meaningful to do. And if you've got one team, let's not invent a project for one tiny little team. Let's, let them do some maintenance work, or iterate on learning some new tool, take a training class, read a book for a few days, something like this. There's a lot of interesting ways that you can absorb and build something meaningful for the future.
Love it. Thank you, Cliff. We
Cool.
are kind of halfway through. There are more questions in here that we're going to cover. I'm going to use this for a little plug in here, because this is also going to be available as an audio on Spotify and elsewhere.
Yeah.
I'm talking with Cliff Hazell, who's an expert when it comes to scaling up the projects and helping companies staying focused on what's really important. And we are picking up questions that are coming through the comments. And I see two more LinkedIn. So people are interested. I'm going to show it on screen. And with your permission, or without it in here, I'm going to butcher everyone's name in here, but I'm going to do my best. So Pavel Kozierovsky is asking, from efficiency point of view, is it beneficial to have number one priority, but also clear number two? So when number one is blocked, we continue immediately with the number two and then switch back.
So in some contexts, I would say yes. I would say the main reason why I think it's important to have a clear one and a clear two is so that we actually, I mean, if number one is the most important thing, probably we should also spend some energy on trying to unblock number one, if that makes sense. And I think the challenge is that very often what we do is, when we run into blockers in the organization, we just stop and wait. And I think that is actually part of the challenge. So, I need Alish for something. And so I just, I wait 6 weeks. And in the meantime, I started something else that actually takes maybe 8 weeks. And so when Alish is finished, it's another 2 weeks before I end up jumping back onto the thing. And so we end up with a lot of this waiting, handoff time switching, and so on. And actually, just touching, I mean, Florian was referencing now in answer to what I was saying about the previous question that he asked. Maybe there is this thing about trying to size the project smaller, but the reality is that if a project takes a full 1 year, I will almost guarantee you that it's not being worked on and moving forward 100% of that time. And so what we're trying to do is, we're trying to take out the waiting gaps, the parts where we're sitting with waiting for Alish to start, waiting for Florian to start, waiting for somebody else to jump on. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the working steps closer together, more than we're trying to, speed up the speed at which we type or do the work, if that makes sense. We're looking for those waiting steps. So, Pavel, yes, it can be okay to know what number two is, so that if you absolutely cannot do anything on number one, or, I mean, sometimes you're waiting on a third party, or it's not possible to always remove the waiting time. But I would say also, what I would emphasize is really the benefit of trying to drive number one forward as much as possible. And so in many cases, if number one is truly number one, you would rather spend time unblocking it than just switching to number two and switching back, if that makes sense.
That's cool. And I see you referred to the answer from Florian as well, the slicing of the project. So I think we have this one covered. So we are still open for more questions. Put them in a comment, put them in a chat, whatever you have available. And as Cliff said, you don't need to type faster. You just need to think about your question and what's the important one and put it in there. In the meantime, I have another one preloaded in here.
Can I pick up on something? I just saw
Go for it.
Tammy Evans saying earlier, only a dozen projects. We were talking about how many projects you want to go.
You're right.
And she's saying lol. And I mean, I have a little story about an insurance company I worked with a few years ago, where it was actually one of the first situations where I built a flight level 2 system. And also, funnily enough, how I met Klaus. I think some of the people on the chat, I recognize that they probably do know Klaus. Basically, what happened there was, I was shown a wall of index cards. They said, this is our projects, this is what we're working on, and 400 projects, 400 cards. Uh, and so I asked, well, how many people? And they said, yeah, it's about 100. And so I said, okay, cool. How many computers does each person have? There's a bunch of software developers. They said only one. So I said, okay, cool. Well, how do you feel about the fact that 75% of those projects are currently not being worked on? And the leader took a minute. He was like trying to decide if he should be frustrated. Am I calling his people lazy? Something like this. And he said, actually, I see your point. Each person can only work on one thing. That means that 300 of those projects are not being worked on right now. And so I think what's interesting, as Tammy is highlighting, is yeah, we have many, many, many projects. And the point is not to try to get down to zero or even to one, but it is to pick one and say that is the number one. Forget if we've got 400 projects, let's make one number one and then we can move forward from there. Yeah.
That's right. And that's this, Tom is responding. I find generally we say, quote unquote, 3 to 4 priorities, but in practice, expect much more than that. Which
Well,
reminds me the quote I think I shared in there, right? That priority is singular. It comes from Latin and it's prior, which means first. So just using it as a plural by itself, it's kind of funny.
that's exactly why I talk about sequencing and not about prioritization. It's trying to get around this issue because everybody has assumptions and sort of default patterns around prioritization. But if we're actually building a sequence, let's fill the effort up in this order. Then people go, oh, okay, cool. It doesn't matter if we've got 500 things if we fill from the top.
Perfect. All right. So more questions, more queries in the chat, please. We're gonna look for that. And let me see. Oh yeah, this is actually interesting. So I wanted to look into something actionable in here because I promised, of course, as a hook for this live, it's like you're gonna get some actionable tips, something you can do. And Cliff, when he saw this, he was scratching his magnificent beard and said, "Yeah, maybe I can get something." So let's see what you got ready. What would be the one small action anyone can take today and see some immediate benefits? And I'm not saying they need to be huge, but something that would actually move the needle a tiny bit.
So I actually wanted to answer this question a little bit. So I kind of addressed it a bit when I talked about this idea of sequencing, because that would be the
Hmm.
biggest win in my mind, is to sequence things. If you can't do it at the company level, at least do it individually. If you can't, you can do it individually, try to do it within your team. If you can do it within the team, try to do it within the department. Like the higher up you can do it, the bigger the impact of that would be. But start basically where you have the influence would be the first thing. And then there were two other things that I would just add sort of as a suggestion there. The one is basically to try to focus on removing the noise. Very often what we're doing is we're spending a lot of time reporting and managing metrics and stuff for all the things that are even below number 17 on the priority list. So like Tammy says, we've got tons and tons of things on the go. The challenge there is that we're busy doing busy work to report on why we didn't deliver the things that we're not actually working on. And so if we can remove some of that noise, either by sequencing or just by cutting some of the stuff from the bottom, that gives us a little bit of capacity to create a little bit. I found a really great word for this the other day. Somebody referred to it as a fire break. Basically, a bit of gap in your calendar where you can absorb other things and actually have some slack time. So I've seen teams practically do this by booking, 1 hour a day or even a couple of hours over the course of the week where they have uninterrupted time. Things like no meeting Friday or no meeting Tuesday, something like this as an example, or time where we actually collaborate and work together. And so that's one way to kind of remove some of the noise and the chaos of all of the other stuff that happens in the organization and create these focused buckets of time where hopefully, if we have a sequence, we work on number one, and yeah, I think that all fits nicely together.
Got it. Now I like the noise removal, right? Because very often, even looking at my inbox, the noise to signal ratio is not favorable at all times. I'm just looking for the actionable step in there, and we are doing it to ourselves.
I think so often what we do is when we have an idea, the ideas usually defaults to adding something. So we add a project, we hire more team members, we expand into new markets, something like this. But often what we could do to make the business better is shut down the noisy stuff that we don't need, that crappy product that nobody really likes or that's really complicated to maintain, that thing that doesn't generate any revenue. Simplify and kind of organize ourselves a little bit better and shut down a project, stop opening new offices, these kind of things, like actually remove some of the noise that we have created. I think often that can create, cancel a meeting. Nobody in your team is ever going to cry if you cancel a meeting, I don't think. I mean, maybe if it's their favorite meeting, but I'm not sure. Do people still have favorite meetings? Is that a thing? Um,
You're my favorite meeting, so I would definitely cry if you didn't show up. But other than that, I hear you.
Fair enough.
Okay, so we got two things in here you mentioned. There's the sequencing, something you can do immediately, kind of putting priority number on your things and then kind of going by the numbers rather than trying to do everything at once.
Hmm.
And the second thing was, kind of cut down the noise a little bit, making sure you have some unobstructed, non-distracted time. Anything else you think that people can do immediately, or we should move to something else? I'm
Nothing else
pushing it,
that's
huh?
coming off the top of my head. I mean, I had it originally written, subtract the noise and create a fire break. Like that's kind of how I describe this in my mind. But I think the thing is, if if you can remove something that is noisy, or you can inject some time where there is silence, those two create kind of, it's two different strategies for creating the same thing, if that makes sense.
Totally. Let's
Mm.
let's let's actually, I wonder how you approach this in companies, because I've been part of teams with different structures, and every now and then the idea of, let's say, no calls Friday, or kind of blocking of times show up, and it usually ends up the same way. It's like, yeah, but what day would it be? I actually have an important call on Thursday, and I have an important call on Wednesday. So, and it ends up with saying, okay, so each individual should be responsible and manage their calendar. And by the end of the week, it means like, yeah, you're on calls the entire week. Do you have any kind of silver bullet or anything that you use when working with clients to empower the entire teams to maybe adopt the same rhythm, or what do you do in these situations?
So I would point back to the sequencing, and this for me is at the core of almost everything. I think very often what we do is we talk about a team, but a team is really, in most contexts that we refer to it, is everybody who reports to the same manager, or everybody who's in marketing. And the definition of team, I mean, you were referring to this earlier about prioritization, but the definition of team means that we have a common goal or a common purpose. We're working together towards something, right? If we're playing a sports game, say we're playing football, but half the team is trying to play cricket or rugby or soccer, or well, soccer is the same game, obviously, but like they're trying to play some other kind of game, we're going to end up in a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. But that's what we're often doing in our organization. This person is trying to get promoted, that person's trying to ship this piece of software, somebody else is trying to manage that project, someone else is trying to build this relationship with a third party partner. I mean, if it's all part of the same project or the same initiative, the same goal in some way, fine. But usually it's not. We're working on many different things. And so that sequencing thing, as I said, you can do it individually, you can do it within the team, do it at the department or the company level. If we can do it within the context of the team, very often what we start to see is, oh, but this is the number one thing for the team, and we all need to come together to work on that thing. So your call that is number 3, 4, 5, 6 suddenly is now less important. Um, you know, I just it's crazy to me how often it is that we have, oh, but we just have to do this, we just have to do this, we just have to do this. And I mean, if you like working like that, keep working that way. But I find it very often that people are frustrated, and it's like, well, you've also chosen to work that way, so let's talk about some other ways. Do you like this way of working? Do you want to be a little bit more like focused, a little bit more sequenced in your approach? And usually the answer is yes, and it's hard to do because that means my pet project over there, well, it's maybe not going to get as much traction. And that's the consequences. So we have to deal with kind of the human behavioral aspect of that, and work through it. And I think often being able to have a healthy conversation, and I don't say conflict in a negative sense, but like some sort of constructive conflict to say, yeah, like we said this thing's number one, but we're actually behaving as if something else is number one, or we're all behaving as if a different thing is number one. Should we talk about that? Let's see how we figure that out, because it doesn't make any sense. We're going to keep getting frustrated and bumping into each other all the time. Um, yeah.
Got it. I mean, you're actually tapping into something really important, and I know we had a private conversation earlier about your favorite books. One of them was James Clear, Atomic Habits. You're talking about human nature in here and behavioral change. So I'm kind of wondering how how are you helping your clients, and how are you implementing it in your life when it comes to kind of breaking these habitual patterns? Because what you said, like, yeah, people overwork themselves, they hate it, they kind of multitask. At the same time, and I'm speaking from my own experience in here, it feels like the default, right? We are falling to this trap because there are so many distractions. I have so many devices on my desk right now, and it's rewarding in the short term. It might be something I resent, but when I don't pay attention, I kind of fall back into it.
Mm.
So what would be the changes that the teams or leaders can implement that might have big benefits, big ROI in, let's say, 6 months time?
Um, I'm wondering if I should risk sounding like a totally broken telephone because I've said sequencing in response to pretty much everything. But I think on an individual level, figuring out what actually is the most important thing. I heard discipline the other day. Someone described it as it's choosing what you want most over what you want right now. And I really like that framing. So if the over the long term, so something that you want 6 months from now is to be, I don't know, happier, healthier, then maybe saying yes to those 65 projects is going to be counterintuitive to that. And so that we need to have that discipline. And what I like about what James Clear talks about is those small shifts in habits. So one of my favorite examples he uses, he talks about if you want to read more, put your book on your pillow when you make your bed in the morning so that when you come to bed that night, you increase the probability that you're going to read before you go to bed. It's not guaranteed to work every single time, but you're more likely to read a book. And I say this as someone who does this. I mean, I don't always make my bed. I don't always put the book on the pillow, but when I do it, it increases the odds. The counterexample is if you want to try to remove something, maybe a bad behavior or something that you're doing. Let's say you eat biscuits all the time and you want trying to cut down on the number of biscuits you eat. Put them in a box. Put them like introduce some friction. Basically, put them in a box in a cupboard that's locked and they hide the key somewhere. Just the fact that you have to go find the key to open the cupboard, to open the box, to get the biscuit, like you're less likely to do it. It's not going to promise that you will never ever do it, but you're just trying to shift it a little bit. It's sort of tilt the odds in your favor. And so for me, like things like sequencing is an example of this, but it's really about consistently doing it. And so I think that's part of it is picking something that is your focus and investing the next 6 months or even the next 6 days of the week in consistently doing that thing because that adds up to a large change over time.
I agree. I like it. So if you're into this, look up Atomic Habits by James Clear. The idea that Cliff described is called friction in that book, and yeah, increasing friction in the non-desired behaviors and decreasing it for the desired ones, that works. I gotta say, I'm a chocoholic, so my girlfriend actually has to hide stuff from me in the logbox with a combination that I don't know. True story. And it does help. It does makes me feel kind of embarrassed, but it does work. Let's see, we
Yeah.
got more questions in here. And with the books, Cliff, I was thinking, if I do that, maybe I will still not read the book. But if I put something heavy like War and Peace, at least, and I kind of work out my muscles by putting it off the bed every time. That there is a way to win there.
I love this idea of taking the friction and trying to remove and reduce the friction or increase the friction. So if you want something to happen more often, uh, reduce the friction. If you want it to happen less often, increase the friction. And I mean, you can use this. You're trying to shift behaviors with your kids, with yourself, in your company, whatever it is. It makes so much sense, and there's so many different ways that you can do it. But it's a different approach to sort of this very direct, like let's go and fix the problem by adding something or making a big change. It's just subtle nudges, do it consistently for a while, and suddenly you start to see quite substantial changes. So, yeah.
Awesome. I see I have no further questions visible in the feed, so this might be a good time to gradually wind down. So I think the most important question in here, if people love this, which I'm sure they did, where do they get more of this? If they want to ask, okay, Cliff, how do I get this magnificent beard as you have, or how do I get your support to get $5 million of my company in the next year? Where do people reach you? What do they do to work with you?
So, I mean, if you want to work with me, the best way is to reach out directly. But I would say generally what I would invite people to do is connect with me on LinkedIn. I post pretty consistently since January, actually. I've been practicing what I've been preaching about making something a clear number one and doing this habit consistently. So I've been posting thoughts and ideas and different things that I read and learn along the way on LinkedIn since January. If you find this interesting, you'd like to explore some more, grab a follow or connect with me on LinkedIn. And feel free to drop me a message. I'd love to chat, meet with all of you, and just get some sense of what resonated, what are you finding interesting, what are you learning along the way. And if you want me to help out in some way, I'm happy to chat about how we could do that as well. Find me through the same channels that I just mentioned. So that would be super cool.
Sounds good to me. And absolutely, if you like these chats, check out my channel as well. If you didn't manage to kind of get the beginning, there's a replay. And if you like to listen, to miss the visual, this is going to be available as podcast episode as well. I see, Cliff, we have one more question here from Charles. Maybe we can pick it up still, a latecomer. Let me put it on
Sure.
screen. And the question from Charles Turpin is, how would you overcome silos between teams when they are supposed to be focusing on and working toward a common goal or goals?
Hmm. So, so this for me, I would look to two key models that I use for thinking about this. For those of you interested, and I'm assuming most of the people who are on the call are kind of interested in the models and tools rather than just my sort of one sentence thought on it. I would look at flight levels, which is basically the way of thinking about the organization at each level and saying, where do we need to make changes in order to address this? So if we've got silos between teams, probably the solution is not inside the team, it's to create collaboration between the teams by building, in flight levels language, a level 2 system. So something to coordinate between those teams. And the other is to look at team topologies, which looks at how do we structure and design the teams and the interfaces between those teams so that we can have better collaboration. And I use both of these fairly often, along with some other tools and tricks that I've picked up along the way to help build these better collaborations. I think the key thing is that we have to have support and buy-in from folks who are in both of those teams, probably from some other stakeholders and folks around those teams. We should get them together and figure out how to build a better thing. So my sequencing thing, we're not just sequencing within the team, we need to sequence across the teams. And so how do we resolve that attention or the tension at least, by picking one clear number one across both teams would be my slightly shorter answer. If you want to know more, just drop me a message. I'd be happy to share some deeper thoughts. There's probably specific things in your context that are hard to take into account from a quick type on a LinkedIn message. So I'd be happy to help.
Brilliant. Thank you for the question, Charles. Thank you for the answer, Cliff. And
It's a pleasure.
So I guess we can kind of aim at closing this. So first of all, thank you, Cliff. Thank you everybody who joined as well for being with us. Thank you for all the amazing questions and amazing answers in here. You've been listening to Cliff Hazell, the SME who helps companies to scale up to actually allow them to focus on the important things. My name is Aleš Balcar, and I'm doing these every week, same time. So if you love those, I'll do my best to bring you as amazing guests as Cliff is every week. And hopefully Cliff is not going to hate me and will be able to kind of join the show somewhere in the future, because this is a super interesting topic and I have a lot of notes here. How was it for you, Cliff?
It's been really cool. I want to thank you for taking the time to invite me and for the conversations. It's been really cool. And obviously to everyone who's asking questions, it's been really nice to hear what you're thinking about. And yeah, let's chat further.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Cool.
Have a lovely rest of the day.